Last month, the US government declassified over 4,000 documents about Amelia Earhart's disappearance. You'd think after 88 years, we'd finally get answers. We didn't. The release was a complete dud. But while everyone focused on those files, there was another source sitting in plain sight. Take a look at this. When the New York Times covered the declassification, they quoted Richard Gillespie from the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, otherwise known as TIGHAR. Quote, "A lot of the really good stuff on Earhart is not in the National Archives. We have found it in other places and we put it up on our website." End quote. So I took a look. Tens of thousands of pages, original radio logs from the USS Itasca, Navy search reports from 1937, forensic analysis, documents publicly accessible for years. And when you read the primary sources, not the headlines, but the actual evidence, what emerges isn't a mystery. It's a tragedy, a preventable one, because here's what actually happened. On July 2nd, 1937, the USS Itasca lost contact with Amelia Earhart at 8:43 a.m. That's the official story. But other radio stations, hundreds of miles away, kept hearing transmissions for days. Transmissions that suggest she didn't crash into the ocean at all. So I think it's time to talk about what the radio evidence actually tells us. First, some context. There are two facts that most people don't know about Amelia's final flight. First, this was Earhart's second attempt to circumnavigate the globe. Secondly, there was actually supposed to be two navigators on Amelia's flight around the world, Fred Noonan and a man named Harry Manning. On Earhart's first attempt to fly around the world, Manning was present in the plane in addition to Noonan. But very famously, Earhart had a landing gear collapse during takeoff in Hawaii. The plane was loaded with nearly 1,000 gallons of fuel. By all accounts, it should have exploded, but it didn't. That was nothing short of a miracle. After the Hawaii crash, Manning backed out. He didn't want to risk his life again. This incident happened in March of 1937 and delayed Earhart's circumnavigation attempt until she could try again a few months later, during which she and Noonan ultimately disappeared forever. Manning was crucial because he was the only one of the three who was actually skilled in radio communications. When he found out Earhart was planning a second attempt with only Noonan, Manning was immediately worried. Here's why. Neither Earhart nor Noonan had mastered Morse code. They both preferred voice communication because it was easier. But here's the problem. Voice signals fade. They get garbled by static. While Morse code, that cuts through interference and bad weather no problem. In a life or death situation over the Pacific, that difference matters. And Manning wasn't the only one who was concerned. Eleanor Smith was the youngest licensed pilot in the United States at just 16 years old. In 1929, she flew with Earhart during a test flight in Delaware. At one point, Earhart took over the controls from the test pilot. The plane immediately started lurching and wobbling. Embarrassed, Earhart signaled for the test pilot to take back control. Years later, Smith recalled in a memoir, quote, "She knew the basics, I guess, but she didn't have that much practice. As sure as God is my judge, she could not keep her nose on the horizon," end quote. After the Hawaii crash, Earhart's husband, George Putnam, didn't have enough money to fully repair the plane. To save on costs, they scaled back on modifications. Stronger radios, scaled back. Better direction finding equipment, scaled back. Emergency gear, scrapped. Before her second attempt, Earhart gave an interview to a reporter named Alan from the Herald Tribune. He asked her why she wanted to do this, and her answer was premonitory. Quote, "I have a feeling that there is just one more good flight left in my system, and I'm hoping this trip is it. I've only got one obsession, a small and probably typical feminine fear of growing old, so I won't feel completely cheated if I fail to come back," end quote. She asked him not to publish this interview until after the flight. While waiting, Alan did some digging into what had been done to prepare the plane, and he noticed something critical was missing from the equipment checklist: the marine frequency radio. This was the device that lets you send distress calls to ships. When he asked Earhart about it, she called it dead weight and reminded him that neither she or Noonan knew much Morse code anyway. Better to leave it behind. These were warning signs that all pointed to the same problem. Earhart didn't understand her radio equipment well enough to use it when things went wrong, and she was about to attempt the most dangerous leg of her journey, 2,500 miles of open ocean with almost no margin for error. The flight from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island was always going to be the hardest part of the journey. The Pacific Ocean is massive. Most planes in 1937 had a range of only a few thousand kilometers. Earhart's modified Lockheed Electra could fly about 6,600 to 7,200 kilometers in perfect conditions. So the night before, on July 1st, Earhart and Noonan stripped the plane of any unnecessary weight. Earhart removed the insulation, making the engine so loud that they had to communicate by passing written notes on a bamboo pole. Noonan left the smoke bombs meant for a sea rescue under his hotel bed. Every decision was about shaving ounces to extend range, but in doing so, they eliminated the redundancies that could have saved their lives. These series of errors turned what should have been a difficult but achievable flight into something impossible. Theoretically, Earhart could fly straight to Lae to Hawaii, but perfect conditions rarely exist over the Pacific. So the game plan was to stop at Howland Island, a tiny strip of land about 2 kilometers long and less than a kilometer wide, sitting roughly halfway between Australia and Hawaii. Finding it from the air would be like trying to spot a grain of rice. So the navigation plan relied on 2 methods: celestial navigation, using the sun, moon, and stars to calculate position, and dead reckoning, which calculates how long it should take to reach the island based on your speed and direction. Earhart and Noonan calculated it would take about 18 hours to reach Howland. But 20 minutes into the flight, Lae radioed a warning. Headwinds were stronger than expected. Earhart didn't acknowledge the message. More on why later. This matters because headwinds change your travel time, and celestial navigation alone isn't accurate enough over such long distances. Small errors can add up. In fact, this already happened earlier in the trip when Earhart and Noonan flew 12 hours across the South Atlantic to Senegal. They ended up landing more than 100 miles away from their intended destination of Dakar because of small calculation errors by Noonan. So to help them along in their most difficult leg of the journey, 3 US Navy and Coast Guard ships were positioned strategically along the route. The USS Ontario halfway between New Guinea and Howland, the USS Swan between Howland and Hawaii, and the most important one, US Coast Guard Itasca, which was stationed right by Howland Island. These ships were supposed to act as radio beacons, like lighthouses that Earhart could home in on using her direction finder. The Itasca was also supposed to send up smoke signals when she got close to help her spot the island. But this is where everything started to go wrong. Between Miami and that final takeoff from Lae, Earhart made 3 critical mistakes, each one survivable on its own, but together proved fatal. In late June, while Earhart was in Java, a radio specialist sat down with her to plan the beacon frequencies for the 3 ships. His plan, expressed in wavelengths, was Ontario 750 meters, Swan 900 meters, and Itasca 750 meters. These were perfect frequencies for Earhart's loop antenna direction finder. But here's the catch. In 1937, radio waves were described in 2 different ways. You could express them as wavelength in meters or as frequency in kilocycles or kilohertz as we call them now. The specialist was speaking in wavelengths, so Earhart needed to convert them into frequencies. The math is straightforward. Wavelength times frequency equals speed of light, which is a constant. So 750 meters equals 400 kilohertz, 900 meters equals 333 kilohertz, and so on. But on June 27, 1937, Earhart sent this message to the ships. Ontario, 400 kilohertz, Swan, 900 kilohertz. She used the wavelength number without converting. And Itasca, 7.5 megacycles, or 7,500 kilohertz, which is catastrophically wrong. Ultimately, Earhart appeared to mix up the wavelength and frequency. Now, why does this matter? Loop antennas like the one on Earhart's plane can only take accurate bearings on frequencies up to about 1800 kilohertz. So by specifying 7,500 kilohertz for the Itasca, the most important beacon, she asked them to broadcast on a frequency more than 4 times too high for her equipment to work. However, in her message, Earhart said that if the frequencies were unsuitable, she should be informed. But nobody on the Itasca questioned it. They just assumed she knew what she was doing. So Itasca turned up its transmitter to 7,500 kilohertz and waited for a message that would never arrive. That was mistake number 1. But weeks before this moment, Earhart had already made another decision that would prove just as catastrophic. In late May, when Earhart reached Miami, she had the trailing antenna completely removed, a 250-foot wire used for Morse code transmissions on 500 kilohertz. Since neither she or Noonan were proficient in Morse code, she considered it once again dead weight. But what she didn't understand was that by removing this antenna, she eliminated her ability to communicate with ships on 500 kilohertz, the one frequency the ship's direction finders could actually use to locate her. With only the tiny fixed antenna on top of the fuselage, her transmitter could radiate only about a half watt of power. For context, that's less than a Christmas light bulb. She was essentially trying to communicate across the Pacific Ocean with the radio equivalent of a whisper. The short antenna also caused another problem. It created a mismatch with the transmitter that made her voice sound distorted and hard to understand, what operators described as over-modulated. There was supposed to be a backup. A direction finder had been set up on Howland Island specifically to take bearings on Earhart's 3105 kHz transmissions. That direction finder also used a loop antenna, which, just like hers, couldn't accurately track frequencies above 1800 kHz. Everyone involved thought it would work because they didn't fully understand the technical limitations of the equipment. So that's 2 critical failures. But remember Harry Manning, the radio expert who backed out? He'd warned Earhart about the 3rd mistake from the very beginning. By choosing to rely entirely on voice communication, Earhart eliminated her most reliable backup system. In the high static environment of the tropics, with a weak antenna and an over-modulated transmitter, this would prove to be a grave error. Speaking of reliable systems, I want to talk about something that has become essential for my work here at Today Learn Science. This video is sponsored by NordVPN because honestly, it is one of my most used apps, and here's why. I've been living abroad since January of 2023 in Southeast Asia, then Europe, on top of traveling internationally pretty much every other week for work. But my entire business still US based, which means NordVPN is basically running 24/7 on all my devices. And here's a perfect example. Remember that Nat Geo Cleopatra documentary from last November? The one I gave you updates on? I literally could not have watched that without NordVPN. Imagine trying to give you a Cleopatra breakdown from a country that doesn't stream that channel. Not happening. But here's what really sold me. Their Threat Protection Pro feature. As someone who constantly downloads scientific papers and images from dozens of websites, I need protection. So if you want to stay safe online and access everything you need while traveling, you can use my link nordvpn.com/TILscience to get 4 extra months. It's completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guaranteed. TLDR, you can try it, and if you don't love it, get a full refund. Okay, now back to the video. Okay, now let me walk you through what actually happened on July 2nd, 1937, using the radio logs and timestamps. About 7 hours into the flight at 7:20 GMT, the Itasca started hearing her transmissions but could barely make out what she was saying. They tried calling her back numerous times. She never responded. This suggests her receiving system had already failed. The most likely explanation is that lightning or static discharge damaged what's called the send-receive relay, a switch that connects the antenna to either the transmitter when you talk or the receiver when you listen. If it got stuck in transmit mode, she could send, but she couldn't hear anything coming back. 9 hours in, Earhart expected to pass the USS Ontario. She listened for Morse code ends on 400 kilohertz, but heard nothing. The original plan was for the Ontario to wait for Earhart to request transmissions. But without the trailing antenna, she could only send high frequency signals and not the low frequency needed to contact the Ontario. Realizing her problem, Earhart sent an urgent telegram asking the Ontario to start transmitting every 10 minutes. But the message didn't reach them in time. At 8:15 GMT, about half an hour later, quote, "Please take a bearing on me now and report to me in half an hour. We're about 100 miles out," end quote. Earhart likely meant to say on the half hour rather than in half an hour. Then at 1912 GMT, Itasca receives the transmission that makes your stomach drop. Quote, "We must be on you now but can't see you. Running out of gas, only 1/2 hour left. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet," end quote. This is where you can hear the panic setting in. The Itasca was right there, transmitting so powerfully that even San Francisco picked up their signal. Earhart's signal was coming in loud and clear to the ship, but she couldn't hear anything from them. She thought the radio had completely failed, and she only had 30 minutes of fuel left. At 1925 GMT, Earhart tried something different. She tried to home in on the ship's beacon herself. Quote, "We are circling but cannot hear you. Go ahead on 7500 now. We're on the scheduled time on half hour," end quote. She was asking them to activate the beacon at 7500 kilohertz. The Itasca immediately started broadcasting Morse code A on that frequency, and Earhart responded right away. "We received your signals on 75 but unable to get a minimum. Please take bearings on us and answer 3105 with voice," end quote. Okay, let me explain what unable to get a minimum means, because this is the crucial moment. When you use a loop antenna for direction finding, you rotate it in a circle. The signal gets louder, louder, loudest, quieter, quieter, then silent. That silent point, the minimum or null, tells you the direction the signal is coming from. Earhart could hear the beacon clearly, but when she rotated her loop antenna, she couldn't find that null point. She couldn't get a bearing. Why? Because again, 7500 kilohertz was far too high for her loop antenna to work properly. She was literally listening to the signal that could save her life, but her equipment couldn't tell her which direction to fly. And here is the cruel irony. There was a workaround. There was a switch in the cockpit that could have bypassed the broken relay. She could have manually switched the receiver to use the loop antenna while keeping the transmitter on the fixed antenna. If she had done that, she would have heard the Itasca's voice transmissions. But unfortunately, she didn't know her equipment well enough to try it. At 2013 GMT, Earhart transmitted her final message. Quote, "We are on line 157-337 running north and south, shifting to 6210 kilocycles," end quote. This was a line of position. Earhart was telling them she was flying along the navigation line, but didn't know where on the line she was. Then she switched frequencies to 6210 kilohertz. And that was the last time the Itasca heard from Amelia Earhart. But the Itasca wasn't the only station listening. Right after Earhart's plane went missing, the US Navy put out an urgent bulletin. Listen to frequencies 3105 and 6210 kilohertz. Those were Earhart's channels. Her plane's radio was only designed to work within a few hundred miles, but radio waves can bounce off the ionosphere and travel thousands of miles if you're listening at exactly the right time. And some people were. A 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, frantically transcribed what she heard. "Water's high, water's knee-deep, let me out. Help us quick." A housewife in Toronto, "We have taken in water, we can't hold on much longer." Nina Paxton in Kentucky heard Earhart's actual call sign, KHAQQ, followed by, "We'll have to get out of here. We can't stay here long." The Coast Guard and Navy logged 120 known reports. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or static, but TIGHAR went back through those logs and found 57 reports they consider credible, all recorded between July 2nd and July 5th. But there was something strange about these transmissions. TIGHAR analyzed the signal strength from all of them. Only Baker Island, the station closest to Gardner Island, heard clear voice signals with Earhart's call sign. Every other station just picked up what's called a carrier wave. You know someone's transmitting, but you can't make out the words. In other words, the farther from Gardner Island, the weaker the signal got. And if you notice, the island just above Baker is Howland Island, the very same island that Earhart and Noonan were supposed to land at to refuel, but never arrived. And eerily enough, Earhart's final radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard vessel at 8:43 a.m. was her stating that she was on the line of position 157337, running north and south. And what other island happens to be on this line of position? Nikamarara Island, also known as Gardner Island. But here's what's even stranger. The messages came in at odd times, not continuously, but in a specific pattern. When TIGHAR mapped those transmission times against historical tide data for Gardner Island's reef, they found something striking. Every single credible transmission occurred during low tide. But why would that matter? Here's the hypothesis. If the plane was partially submerged on the reef, Earhart would have a problem. Her radio needed the plane's battery, but so did the engine starter. She couldn't just leave the radio on, otherwise she'd drain the battery and never be able to restart the engine. But if the engine was in the water, she couldn't run it at all. She'd have to wait until low tide when the propeller cleared the water, then start the engine to power the radio to send out a message. That would mean Earhart and Noonan were stuck on a schedule dictated by the ocean, seeking shelter during the day, returning to the plane at low tide to try the radio again. If true, this means they survived the crash and were alive for at least 3 days, waiting for rescue that never came. But if Earhart made it to Gardner Island, there should be physical evidence. And 3 years after her disappearance, someone found it. In 1940, a British officer named Gerald Gallagher found human bones on Gardner Island along with a woman's shoe, a sextant, and a jar of 1930s era freckle cream. The bones were examined by a doctor in Fiji, declared to be male, and discarded. This wasn't unusual for the time. Forensic osteology, or the study of bones, barely existed as a discipline, but it means we can't do a DNA analysis. The bones are gone, but what we do have are the measurements. In 2018, forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Jans reanalyzed the original measurements using a modern program called Fordisk, a software that estimates sex and ancestry from skeletal dimensions. It's widely used by forensic anthropologists today, though it has its fair share of critics. Jans compared the bone measurements to Earhart's known measurements from photographs and her pilot's license. His conclusion: the bones matched Earhart's proportions more closely than 99% of individuals in his reference sample. Now, what's interesting is that Gallagher wrote in his report that the bones were also found near remains of fires, turtles, and dead birds, signs that whoever died there has survived for, quote, some time. I want to be clear, none of this is definitive proof. The bones are gone. The plane hasn't been found. But here's what we know for certain. Multiple people reported hearing distress calls days after the Itasca lost contact, documented by both the Navy and Coast Guard. Gardner Island sits on that 157337 line of position from Earhart's final transmission. Human bones were found there in 1940. Modern forensic analysis suggests they could have been Earhart's. Does that solve the mystery? No. But it suggests something far more haunting than a quick crash into the ocean. That Amelia Earhart made it to land, survived, and sent desperate messages while the world searched thousands of miles away. She died waiting for someone to hear her. Before her final flight, she told that reporter she had one more good flight left in her. And she was right. But it wasn't the flight she planned. 88 years later, we're still trying to bring her home. Look, I know what you're thinking. If TIGHAR has all this evidence from 30 years of investigating, why hasn't the mystery been solved? I had the same question. So I flew to Pennsylvania and asked Richard Gillespie directly and had him show me everything. The artifacts, the expedition footage, the forensic analysis. And I asked him the hard questions. Why hasn't the plane been found? What do you say to people who think you're wrong? And what convinced you after all these years that you're even searching in the right place? His answers are next. You don't want to miss that. Thanks for watching.